What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for purchase on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today, my guest is Dr. James Matlock. Jim received a BA in English from Emory University in 1977 and a Ph.D. in Anthropology from the University of Southern Illinois at Carbondale in 2002. He has worked at the American Society for Psychical Research in New York City and at the Rhine Research Center in Durham, North Carolina. He is presently a research fellow at the Parapsychology Foundation. His chief research interests are the history of parapsychology, anthropology of religion, and reincarnation. Jim also teaches a 15-week online seminar course on reincarnation research and theory. In today's interview, we discuss the fascinating and puzzling phenomenon of children who seem accurately to recall past lives. We discuss the pioneering work of the Canadian-born psychiatrist Ian Stevenson, who founded the field. We examine some of the arguments of the skeptics. And we take a deep dive into startling cases where children exhibit not only apparent memories, but also behaviours and birthmarks associated with their past lives. We finish by discussing the shattering implications for these cases for understanding the human condition. I'm here with Dr. James Matlock, who is an anthropologist and an expert in the evidence for reincarnation. So welcome, Jim.
Well, thank you, Matt. I'm glad to be here. Very happy to be here.
What we're going to do today essentially is to walk through Jim's work and also primarily through his very excellent book, Signs of Reincarnation. But I'd like to start off, Jim, by asking you, how did you get interested in parapsychology and in reincarnation research in the first place?
Yes, well, that's quite interesting, I suppose. I went to college in the early 1970s. I'm in my 71st year now, so it dates me a little bit. But at the time, I wanted to be a writer, a creative writer. I wanted to write fiction. And so I majored in English actually, but I was also interested in psychology, so I double majored in psychology. The psychology at the time in the early 70s was behaviorism, and it really turned me off to psychology. So I didn't continue that for graduate studies. I went into anthropology, as you noted. But I was interested in fiction, so I was reading a lot of fiction, right? And preparing to write it, And when I got out of school, when I got out of college or university, I suppose you would say in the UK, I tried to write, but I found it very difficult, much more difficult than I had imagined. You had to make a living at it, right? So I started looking around for a nonfiction topic, and reincarnation is something that I had noticed coming up very often in the books that I'd been reading in the fiction. Sometimes it was a metaphorical rebirth, and sometimes it was a literal reincarnation, past life memory. Jack London, for instance, has a book like that, and it intrigued me. I really, at that point, and this was around 1980 or so, I figure, when I finally gave up with the fiction writing and started looking around for other topics. And I went to my local library And I was looking around, the New Age section, because that's where these things were coming out in the 1970s. And I was, after giving up behaviorism, that's sort of what I drifted into. And I came across the reincarnation books, and there really wasn't anything at the time. Now there's Ian Wilson, Scott Rogo, these sort of general books on it, but there wasn't anything like that. So I thought, well, this is kind of an intriguing thing, and maybe I could write something of a general nature on reincarnation. That's how I got into it. And then and that led me to Ian Stevenson, and Ian Stevenson led me to parapsychology. And once I found that, then that was it. Once I realized that there was a serious field dealing with these things that I'd become so interested in, that was hooked. I was hooked.
So brilliant. I think though we probably need to start to talk about Ian Stevenson and discuss his work, because he's absolutely pivotal in sort of reincarnation research, isn't he?
He is, absolutely. Yeah, Stevenson is very interesting, actually, because he was born in Canada, in Quebec, in 1918, and then so he had several decades. He was trained as a physician. He had several decades in mainstream medicine, and then went into psychiatry because he was disappointed with the mainstream medicine. It didn't help him answer the questions that he had. And those questions had to do with what now would be considered, mind body sort of issues, and psychosomatic medicine and this sort of thing. He just didn't find the answers there. He tried various areas in psychology, and in medicine, before he came to psychiatry. He just didn't find anything that really fit him. So he went into psychiatry, but very quickly he found psychiatry was Freudian, and that he didn't really like that very much. So he was hired at age 38. He was actually 39 when he went to University of Virginia. Tenure track as chairman of the department at the University of Virginia, because he was already coming out as anti-Freudian. And this is late 1950s at this point. So I think it's clear that they were looking for somebody who would take a critical view of Freudian psychiatry, because that was still dominant at the time. But he was already moving away from that. He was already questioning it. Now, at around the time that he went to UVA, he was also getting interested in reincarnation. He was getting interested in psychical research at the same time, but particularly in reincarnation. And he was honest enough to tell people in his interviews that he was getting interested in parapsychology, and he was hired anyway. So he went there in 1958. By 1961, he had gotten interested enough in the reincarnation stuff that he went on his first tour of investigation. And I should say, actually, the year before that, in 1960, and this is what led to that, he published a review article in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research about past life memories that he had run across. And this was something that psychical research parapsychology really had not paid attention to up to that point. So his review article really broke new ground on that. And it opened the minds of people to the possibility of past life memory and of reincarnation. And that led to him to getting a grant from the Parapsychology Foundation that allowed him to go to India and Ceylon, as Sri Lanka was then known, in 1961, in his first tour investigation. So that's what led him into this. And what he found was so intriguing that he kept with it for the rest of his career.
That's brilliant. I seem to remember he got some private funding. Was it the Xerox Corporation as well? So
It was, and so his initial funding came from the Parapsychology Foundation, but he had also made contact with Chester Carlson, who is the inventor of the Xerox process, and made a lot of money from it, right? And so he was able to then fund Stevenson's research. So after that initial grant from the Parapsychology Foundation, he had the benefit of money coming from Chester Carlson.
Oh, oh, brilliant. So that was it 1966? He comes up with with a book called 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. Is that right? That was the first one, wasn't it? Or
Yes, that was his
um,
first collection of case reports, and yes, it was published in the Proceedings of the American Society for Psychical Research in 1966. It was later republished by the University of Virginia in a second edition in 1974, and that's the edition. The paperback edition is 1980. That's the edition that we now know. That's still in print, actually, from UVA. It's been a bestseller for them, really.
oh, brilliant. And we should probably also say that it's gone through various names, hasn't it? But he founded what's now known as the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, and that's still active, isn't it, in terms of
Yes, it's
doing
still
research?
Yes, it's still active. Yeah, he founded that because he wanted to move away from from his responsibilities as chairman of the department and actually from his clinical practice because he had a practice for a while into research. And he managed to negotiate the creation of this department, of this division within the Department of Psychiatry. So initially, it was the division of parapsychology, and then it was the division of personality studies, and it's now the division of perceptual studies. Right, but it's still there. It's still there. He died in 2007, and it was and Jim Tucker took over after that. Many of your listeners will be familiar with that name too. Tucker is now retired, and so we have a DOPS 3.0, as they like to call themselves, but they're very good. A new team in place, and there's a new director now. I haven't met her yet, but she's just joined this fall, just recently, and so they have a very bright future. But they're still there, and they're still doing reincarnation, also in the E's and other sorts of areas that are related in some way to reincarnation consciousness studies in general.
We should probably also say about the particular kind of research that Ian Stevenson did in reincarnation, because sometimes, particularly with the older studies, it was focused on adult recollection of past lives through hypnosis. So in the 50s, there was the case of Bridie Murphy, wasn't there? Ian Stevenson was suspicious of that, and that's why he turned to very young children.
Right. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, actually. You're right. Bridie Murphy came out in 1956, and it was a search for Bridie Murphy, and that was a really big event. It became a bestseller, worldwide bestseller, not just in the United States. And so a lot of people, really taken with reincarnation. They started having come as you were parties and various things. It was a big cultural event. And that, of course, led to skeptical pushback. So the skeptics came in and they successfully demolished the case. And so what had been a great public interest in reincarnation and, sort of buying into it, which is, over the top buying into it, the skeptics within a matter of months managed to turn that around by raising sort of typically in a typical skeptical sort of way of distorting things, leaving things out, and sort of, for instance, they claimed that Virginia Teague, this was the person who recalled the Bridie Murphy life, that it was all made up because she had had an aunt from Ireland who could give him all these stories, and it was based on that. Well, it turned out that actually the Irish aunt had never been in Ireland. She had born in the United States. She had Irish heritage, but she had never been to Ireland. There's no way she could have communicated all this. And yes, she came to live with Teague's family, but only when Teague was a teenager. So I mean, it just all fell apart. However, once it was debunked, and so a lot of a lot of the public still thinks that it was successfully debunked. It was and it wasn't. So Bridie Murphy, it was never identified. In fact, research on that, it really makes it seem like there was nobody named Bridie Murphy who existed, or Brian Murphy, her husband, supposedly. However, what's interesting about this case, and what interested Stevenson about it, is that there were details that Teague remembered under hypnosis that were really very, very recondite, and not the sort of thing that could just been thought up of. It would not be sort of coincidence. I mean, addresses in Cork and things like this. And so it's an interesting case in that respect. It seemed to have some sort of memories which were incorporated in something which, as best we can tell, is a fantasy, right? So the fantasy part of it is the names and maybe some other things are sort of distorted, but there was some memory under that, right? And this turned out, this is sort of characteristic of regression cases, and this is what Stevenson realized fairly early on. And you're right, initially he was interested in regressions. And he tried to use it for a while, but as he looked into more and more cases, he realized that they really didn't produce anything of evidential value. Meanwhile, he had gone to India and Ceylon and encountered these children. And what intrigued him about that is that he went, having read these stories and heard about them, and he expected to hear or encounter the children who had memories only about previous lives, right? But what he found was these cases are much more than just memories of previous lives, because the kids remembered the previous lives in enough detail they could actually go and find the deceased people who they used to be, right? And once that was done, it became very clear that besides the memories, there are also behaviors and personality traits. So there was a lot other than just memories that were carried over. It was the personality, it was the behaviors that were repeated. And sometimes it was physical stuff too, right? That reappeared. And so it was much, much richer phenomenon than he originally thought. And it was a richness that just did not come through in the regressions at all. So he's quickly set aside regressions and spent his career focusing on the kids.
And these, we should probably say, these tend to be memories from very young children. So this is pretty much as soon as they can speak, or even before they can speak, they start exhibiting these memories, don't they?
Yes, that is quite true. Yeah, we're talking about kids 2 to 3 years old now, and some of them 18 months. And a lot of them are very precocious in a lot of ways, but it's particularly in speaking. So 18 months for these kids is not unusual for them to start saying something. No, they don't speak in full-blown sentences, but they will at 18 months, they will say names that turn out to be relevant, to the life that they're recalling. And sometimes you're right. I mean, even before they start speaking, they may display behaviors that turn out to be related to that life.
So, I mean, you've been involved in investigating several of them, and your book, Signs of Reincarnation, actually starts with the case of, is it Rilo O'Banian,
Yes,
that
right.
you
Yes.
actually investigated? Was that back in 2012, 2013? So could you tell us a little bit about that particular case and how you got involved?
Yeah, sure. Well, my book came out in 2019, and I actually investigated that case the year before in 2018. It was a rush thing
Oh,
because I,
okay.
I had written I had written the book, but what you're thinking of, the date was when the Ghost Inside My Child
Oh, okay.
uh,
Yeah.
came out with a podcast, and she was featured on the second season of Ghost Inside My Child. Now, I got to her case a few years after that, right? So I could look at that. But that, but I okay. I had written my book, and it's an academic book. And for academic books, they're treated just like academic journal articles are. They have reviewers, peer reviewers, right? And one of my reviewers for the book suggested that I start with a case. So the book was already written. And here I am asked by the editor in response to this review comment to start with a case. And I thought, the reviewer meant for me just to pick one of Stevenson's cases or whatever to start with a case to make it effective. And I said to the reviewer, well, how about if I start with my own case, right? And she said, sure. And so I had learned about this case. I had begun investigating it, but I hadn't been out to the family. But so this was at the last minute, and I had just a few months to go out and investigate the case and then write it up for the book. So yeah, it was the year before that I finally did investigate it. So it was quite interesting, and I had seen at this point the Ghost Inside My Child episode, so I had some awareness of it. And as I say, I had begun investigating it, so I had collected some material about it. But I went out to Oklahoma, where she lived, and interviewed her. She's now 10, Rylan was. When she was young, very young, around 2 or so, her first year, she was pretty much a model child. In her second year, she became very different. She began exhibiting all sorts of traumatic sorts of behaviors. She would begin sleepwalking and leaving her room and getting in bed with her mother. And then if she was put back on her bed, the same thing would happen. And as she got a little bit older, and this went on for years, this sort of behavior. Like she got a little bit older, she would want tags cut out of her shirts, the backs of her shirts. She would say that the tags in her shirts were bothering her, at the back of her neck, and she wanted all of that, you know. So this model child has become this, this problem kid, and I don't know what to make of this. Then when and I have to look back, at the case to see the ages. So I'm not going to say the ages.
Sure.
But the next major event was the mother decided to take portraits, formal photographs of the family, right? And she hired a photographer to come in. Some of them were in the house, some of them were out of the house. One was of Rylan outside in the family garden, and it's just in the picture that was taken. She's seeing something. She says, aghast. Something clearly was amiss. Something was bothering her terribly. You didn't know what it was because you just have a photograph of her. Now, and the mother took these prints and she framed them. That particular one she put in her office. Whenever Rylan visited the office and saw this photograph, she would tell her mother, I was older when that picture was taken. This makes no sense. How could you be older? She would argue with her, right? It doesn't make any sense. You were 3, whatever it was. You know, and she kept saying, I was older. Every time she saw the picture, I was older in the picture. All right. So the next clue of what's going on is a couple of years later when her mother is reading her a bedtime story and she just turned off the light and Rylan says to her, do you remember that picture when I was bigger? And her mother starts into this, how could you be big? And she says, I died. And she said, and you can just imagine the mother at this point. So she says, this is her first memory of this. And she says, I was in our yard. And this is why the picture is significant because as it turns out, again, I don't want to get too far ahead because I'll explain this more later. But what she was looking at jogged her memory, right? And that's why she was so aghast in that photograph. And that's why the photograph reminded her, of being bigger and of dying. At that point, she said that she was in our yard and she was hit by lightning. Now, after that, she began to remember more things. And she would start talking about having been, or she wouldn't say I was in, but she would start talking about Louisiana. her brother at one point asked her where she used to live, and she said Canada. She mentioned the name Jennifer a couple of times, and then it wasn't until she was 6. It wasn't until she was 6. The memories are gradually becoming clearer, you see, over this period. She said she has a clearer memory, and she says to her mother, I died I died in a plane crash. And this was the final clue her mother needed to go to the internet, because if it's a plane crash, there's probably going to be news stories about it, right? There's probably going to be some documentary evidence of it. So she went to the internet and she looks for plane crashes in Canada. Girl has also mentioned Louisiana. And I think that's basically what she has. She's looking for plane crashes, uh, and also the year. The girl said she asked her mother what year she was born, and mother said 1971. You know why? So she had that, but that's all she had. So she looks in Canada first. Nothing. There's no plane crashes there. She looks in Louisiana. Yeah, there was a plane crash. It wasn't in 1971. It was in 1982. It was in Kenner, not Canada, Kenner, Louisiana. And it was a Pan Am plane which took off from the Louisiana International Airport, which is in Kenner, a suburb of New Orleans, and crashed. It hit a low altitude wind shear and crashed into a residential neighborhood less than a mile from the end of the runway. So everybody on the plane died, and 6 people on the ground did, including a child named Jennifer. Remember? And the Jennifer was one of the names that Ryland had remembered.
Yeah.
So then things began to click into place. Jennifer was 11. She was born in 1971.
Oh, right. So yes, it was Jennifer Schultz, wasn't it?
This was Jennifer Schultz. And so the things are beginning to fit into place, right? The things are snapping in. So then with that, this was a major event. I mean, there were a lot of news stories about this, right? And so there's a lot of documentation and more and more about this. Now, when the Ghost Inside My Child thing was aired, so she first contacted Ghost Inside My Child, that is Ryland's mother, before Ryland had the dream, right? Before they knew who Jennifer was, right? During the course of emails with the team there, the producers and so forth, at Ghost Inside My Child, Ryland remembers this. Okay, so when they went out to film Ghost Inside My Child, they knew this, right? And so they went to Kenner and they met the next door neighbor who across the street from Jennifer, and and confirmed a lot of this, but the significant thing for me was that Ryland's mother is describing all of this in email before we know that Ryland is remembering a real person and have a name to it, right? So this is an example of a case with a written record, which is an ideal that we look for in this research. We try to get records that are written or recorded before the memories are verified, because that way we can't have critics and skeptics coming in and say, oh, it's just memories were distorted, memories were wrong. We've got that written record, and we've got that in this case. Now, when I went to talk to Ryland when she was 10, Ryland told me something else that was new for her, that was not in the Ghost Inside My Child. And it was different from what she had said before to her mother. What she remembered at that point in a 10 was dying not in her yard by electrocution, by lightning. She remembered being in the carport of her house, talking on the telephone. And this was 1982. So you have to imagine, one of these we didn't have cell phones then. So, so one of these phones with the long cords coming out of the door to the kitchen and to the carport, right? So she's sitting in a swing in the carport, talking on the phone. watching this plane come towards her. Now, this fits with Jennifer's house. I mean, this fits with what actually happened to Jennifer Schultz, right? Rylan told me that she was electrocuted over the telephone line. That's what she remembered. Now, after talking to Rylan, I went to Kenner and talked to a lot of her, Jennifer's friends. None of her friends knew what happened to her. It took 3 days. There was you can imagine, okay, so the plane hit not just Jennifer's house, but houses on 3 blocks. That's how big the demolition field was. It was huge. So it took 3 days for Jennifer's body to be found. And 3 days is an eternity for the news cycle, right? By 3 days, there were no longer stories about Jennifer, right? And that was the first day. So there was nothing. There was no news stories about Jennifer, where she was found or anything. Nothing about the autopsy. But when I was there, I went and got her autopsy report. And the autopsy told me that Jennifer's body had been found on the floor of the carport. Now, her friends were telling me that the plane took it up and, took it away, and it was found in a swimming pool. It had all these different ideas. Nobody knew, right? So but besides confirming that her body was found on the floor of the carport, the autopsy said that there was no sign of smoke inhalation in the lungs. There was no discoloration of the blood. What those things indicate is that she was dead by the time the plane set the whole place on fire, right? Before the fire, she was dead, quite possibly by an electrocution, right? Before the plane hit the building. Now, another thing I learned is that, and I could see actually when I was there, it had been rebuilt, but the electrical line and telephone line passed right in front of the house. So the plane in crashing would have come right through. It would have sliced right through the power line and right through the telephone line. I also learned that during that period, it seems like this is a long time ago, but during that period, the power lines were not insulated in that area. So you can imagine an uninsulated power line coming down and striking the telephone line. Quite possibly there was an electrical surge, up the telephone line. She's talking on the telephone. So it makes sense. It's possible. And although we can't prove this at this point, I mean, her body was totally burned, and so there would be no marks. There's nothing to look at anymore. But we do have this autopsy report, which tells us there was no smoke inhalation and no discoloration of the blood, which indicates that that she was dead first and lying on the floor of the carport by the time So what Jennifer remembers at age 10 was something nobody knew, nobody guessed, but is confirmed by the autopsy report, which apparently nobody had looked at. So this is why it's really a very strong case.
Yes, I mean, it's a bit frustrating there are those gaps. So it's technically circumstantial, but it seems to be strongly suggestive of the circumstances that she reported.
So that's right. That's exactly right. Everything ties together. It is, you can't prove anything because, exactly. It's all circumstantial, but there's so many details to the circumstantial stuff. It just all adds up. And one of the really interesting things about this is how long it took for her to be clear about the way she died, right? Because at first she doesn't have any idea, and then gradually she remembers having died, but she remembers being electrocuted, but she thinks it's by a lightning strike, and then it took more time for it to be clear. So that's very interesting. Now, coming back to the tree and why it was the scene that Jennifer would have seen from the swing in the carport, and the swing I want to say something about too, but the swing and from her vantage, looking across the street, there was a partial lot that was open, and there was a tree there, and the configuration of the tree and the power line, because she would looked at the power pole too, were fit exactly what she would have seen. When I was there, I sent from my phone. I sent to Ryland's mother, a picture, and she sent me back. She had the aha immediately when she saw that picture that I sent. She sent me back a picture of what Ryland would have seen. She went out to the yard and took a picture from Ryland's vantage point, and that's when we realized that what had set Ryland off was this remembering what she had seen as she died.
Okay. I mean, and these cases are quite often like this, aren't they? They're quite complicated
Yeah,
and messy. And I think because I did your yes, just for listeners, Jim does a very good online course on reincarnation. It's very it's academically focused, and there's a lot of coverage of case studies. So on the course, you have to look at individual case studies and try and make judgments about whether you think it's a social construction explanation or reincarnation explanation, or others which we can go into a little bit later. But I think it's important for people to have a realistic idea of the complexities of some of these cases, isn't
yes,
it?
it is. It's very important. Before we leave Ryland, I just want to say quickly
Yeah,
about
no,
the
it's fine.
swing, because a swing in a carport, I mean, that's not a common thing. I had never seen a swing in a carport. I never heard of one. Um, and I argued with her a little bit. Do you mean a porch swing? A swing in a yard? Because she initially talked about the yard. No, no, no. She was sure it was a swing in a carport. When I was there, walking around her old neighborhood, oh, I found a house with a swing just a block away from it, but untouched, by this, with a swing in the carport. So there were swings it's in the edge of the carport, so there's plenty of room for the car to park too. But it was there. I mean, in that neighborhood, there were in fact swings in carports.
I I think that's an important thing because again, another feature of these cases, it's quite often those sorts of details that kind of
Yeah.
pull you up a little bit. Because and we can talk about this quite often when skeptics, I think Leonard Angel's one of them, Chris French and others, talk about these reincarnation cases. Quite often the claim is that there's an illusion of significance with these questions. So what's happened is that sort of maybe parents and investigators, the claim is, have compiled these statements that might seem impressive, but that they're actually very generic and it's due to chance. And actually, I wanted to ask you because I had Chris French on earlier this year, and he did a program for Channel 4, I think, and it's reported in his book, The Science of Weird Stuff, where they went out to the Lebanon, to the Druze people who do have an active belief in reincarnation. And he was essentially saying that quite a lot of the kids in one of the schools that he went to, they were all recalling past lives. And I think the sort of implication is that what happens is that reincarnation researchers sort of cherry pick cases that by chance seem to correspond. And I don't know whether you'd like to respond to that, because I think I'd like to see whether there can be a response to that sort of criticism.
Oh, yeah. I guess there's several things that I would say in response to it, and I'm not sure quite where to start. Maybe with the Druze. The Druze are, there's reincarnation is a central part of the Druze religion, and we should say, they're Druze are found primarily in Lebanon, also some on the Golan Heights, in Israel, in across the border in Syria, and also a few in Jordan. But I think the largest number of them are probably in Lebanon. And Stevenson studied cases in Lebanon, and so did Erlander Harrelson, another researcher. Um, yeah. So their sense, Stevenson's sense, because he studied cases in many different places, right? That the Druze probably have more cases than anywhere else per capita. So they're particularly common there, and it wouldn't surprise me if every child, in a Druze school had past life memories. I'm told that every family has cases, for instance. I now, and one of the things we need to be aware of, this is the second point, is that not all of these past life memories are equally strong, right? Not all the cases are as well developed as Ryland, and some were even better developed than Ryland is. For instance, I mean, James Leininger, for instance, some of your, you know, listeners will be, aware of that case. That's a very famous one. It's very detailed, right? Most cases are not that way. Most children's past life memories don't even include names necessarily. They may just be, vague memories. So a kid may just say, "I remember having lived before," not give enough details for researchers to look into that. So, right, yeah, researchers need to be selective because the only cases that really are worth investigating or the unusual cases that have enough details there to them that you can go and what we call solve, right? Investigate properly and find the previous person. And that's not going to be every case. And in particularly in other societies where the cases are not as plentiful, you do have to cherry pick in a sense. I mean, you do have to be selective, right? Now, what Stevenson did to avoid the cherry picking sort of thing, is he collected data about every case that he heard about, right? And so his files at the University of Virginia include data on upwards of 2,500, by the time he died, upwards of 2,500 cases that he had investigated. Now, he only published accounts of a few hundred of those, right? And the rest of them he kept for statistical pattern analyses. And a lot of those cases that that he used for the pattern analyses, he did not fully investigate, right? And many of them, didn't have enough there for you to fully investigate anyway. They were just, partial things. So that charge is a little bit unfair because on the one hand, yeah, you do have to select which cases you're going to spend time with, right? And you're going to select the cases that are theoretically more significant or have are more full-bodied. But that actually turns out to be the majority of the cases that are worth following up. So it's not like, we go to the Drews, for instance, and we have all these very, very strong cases and we choose which ones to pick. No, it's like most of the cases are not going to be all as strong as Ryland's or some of these others, right? And so you only choose. Now, Erlinda Harrelson that I mentioned there, in order to address this very issue, has a paper where he chose at random 3 cases that he had studied among the Druze, or not yet studied, but 3 cases that he had collected some preliminary data on, 3 cases to study in more detail and publish in more detail. So, and those are the 3 cases he studied and published, right? So it's not like there's a follow drawer problem here, coming back to what the experimental term, which is where you collect data and then you don't publish it, right? Because it's not significant. We don't have that. We have he intentionally, looked at all of the cases that he had investigated, selected 3 randomly, followed up those 3, published those 3. And we can see from those that the characteristics of those 3 cases really are not that much different from other Druze cases. They're really not.
Mm. That's interesting because I think what often gets underemphasized in the critical literature that I've seen is that actually by now quite a lot of statistical work has been done on these cases, hasn't there? Even in just the last few years.
Well, even going back into the 1980s, there were pattern analyses. But you're right. I mean, you're exactly right. And this is the critics tend to focus on the cases, on case studies, And they're more guilty of the cherry picking than the investigators are, because the investigators write in great detail. The critics tend to pick on one little thing in the case, and they're also not beyond twisting or distorting or alleging fraud when there's no suggestion of fraud, right?
I noticed in your book there was actually a discussion of what I thought was an important point in this context of there seem to be features of these cases which are culturally specific and features which are universal, which I think is quite an important point to bring up if you're going to claim that this is just social construction. So, the idea that it's just cultural phenomenon.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, what we were talking about is the pattern analyses and the way that critics and skeptics tend to not to deal with them, um,
Mm.
and focus on the case studies and distort them and try to dismiss them for one reason or another. As I say, Stevenson started with these pattern analyses back in the 80s, and this is one of his original intents. One of the reasons why he collected data on so many cases, on all the cases, was so that he could do these sorts of pattern analyses. So that was his plan from the beginning. What but he backed away from that. And the reason that he did was he was not prepared for the skepticism that his first book, 20 Cases of Reincarnation, Suggested Reincarnation, that was published in 1966, we said earlier. He thought that with that publication would open people's eyes to it, right? By people's eyes, I mean, academics and funding sources and all this. And he imagined that he would then be able to get federal US funding for this, just as he was able to get funding from, for his research before this, other types of research. But that didn't happen, and so the conclusion that he came to is that it's too early to do the pattern analyses. The conclusion he came to is I've got to double down on the case studies, right? I've got to show that there is something to this phenomenon before I can go on to the pattern analyses. Now, and that's why, that may be one reason why the critics have focused on the cases, because he's put out so many cases. But also, I think that was a wrong thing to do, because I think the patterns really strengthen the whole argument for reincarnation, because you're right. I mean, there's certain patterns, the universal patterns, and even, and the cross-cultural things, which I'll say more about in a second. These are not random sorts of patterns, and you can't really dismiss them as easily. And that's maybe one reason why the critics haven't really gone after that. It's not so easy for them to dismiss this stuff, and therefore they just ignore it. Or they may just not be aware of it, because most of these critics are not really very well acquainted with this research. And in fact, they've admitted this to me. I mean, one critic in particular admitted this when we were talking about this or in email, and you know, and I was trying to one of the things that I would like to do is to have a dialogue with one of these skeptics sometime about this. But the trouble is, the skeptics don't really know enough about these cases to have a well-informed dialogue. And this is something that came up. He said, "Well, they haven't read Stevenson," and I said, "Well, yeah, that doesn't keep them from talking about him, though." And that was sort of it. We didn't. That was sort of it. The point. But this is the problem. The critics come out with all of this stuff, all of these arguments, but they don't really know what they're talking about. And that's why you can't really engage them very well in sort of dialogue, because they're not acquainted with these cases in any sort of detail.
I mean, I think one of the things that really came across doing your course was how much research has actually been done, not just from Stevenson and Jim Tucker, but we were even engaging with new researchers in, say, South America and India,
Yeah.
and I think that was one of the critiques, wasn't it, actually, with the cases in sort of the global South and sort of indigenous communities, that Stevenson was just going to
say, a village and working through an interpreter. But that's actually very significantly shifted, hasn't it? And it's much more local investigators now.
Yes, it has, and this is a really important development. So Stevenson, flew out around the world, and then he trained Erlander Harrelson and Antonia Mells and Jürgen Kyle, who's the third one that Stevenson trained. He later trained Jim Tucker. And I call these sort of elite investigators, right? Who fly out to these other countries around the world and investigate these cases. Now, they don't speak the local languages. Antonia Mills, as an anthropologist, learned Hindi, to get into her cases, but she never became really fluent in it because she was working in British Columbia and working with the native languages there. And so it was a little bit too much to get into all that. But she did at least make the effort. Yes, I mean, this is one of the major criticisms of Stevenson's research. He was working through interpreters. Also, that when it's sort of expensive, right? Even if you have backing from somebody like Chester Coulson, it's expensive to fly out halfway around the world and spend time there. So they only spent a day or two on a given case, right? And this was another criticism. So what we're seeing in more recent years is no longer the elite investigators. We're now seeing more local investigators who speak the languages, know the cultures, can spend more time there because it's not so far for them to travel. They don't need the same. But with that is unfortunately coming a criticism because except for Okado in Japan, who is at a university, most of these people are not at universities. So it's a sort of a lay, from an academic point of view, a lay approach to studying these cases. And so we're beginning to see that criticism and that skepticism. Yes, we have these new people, but they're not academics.
It's a bit like whack-a-mole with skeptical arguments. You hit one and then something else
comes up. That's right.
Somewhere else. I think this is sort of the double bind that you're in, that it's not considered, I guess, likely enough to justify serious university funding and attention. But when we try and get the research done anywhere as thoroughly as we can, then it's not, like you said, because quite often it's people who may be not involved with the university system. It gets criticised from that direction too. I mean, I think there's more than enough seriously strange material there to easily justify a lot more investigation of this. And also, I think it's important to emphasize that it does seem to affect people's lives. It's like, for example, I was actually talking to a friend of mine about the issue of things like gender dysphoria and past life memories. It was sort of in the context of sort of trans issues, actually, and they had no idea that this research existed. So I was able to forward them a research paper on this, and they were saying, "Wow, it really helps me understand some things. I never understood it." And it's like a lot of people, I think, would be really fascinated by this research.
Yes, and benefit from it. Things are slowly changing. I mean, as the consciousness field becomes a little bit, more sensitive and open, not just to the reincarnation, but to the possibility that NDEs actually are, the conscious is actually separating the body, or more interested in deathbed, phenomena, end of life phenomena. And we're getting more and more things out from hospice workers now, where these things are, observed, and you're getting more and more people coming out and saying, hey, there's something going on here that we need to be more, it's become, things are beginning to shift. I would say in the last 10 years that I can see a notable shift in the receptivity to this. It's becoming easier to publish in mainstream journals. We still don't have enough there, but things are beginning to get out into mainstream journals now that are beginning to raise the question about this, raise the awareness of this. And I think it's possible because people are beginning to finally seriously question whether materialism has all the answers.
Yes, 100%. And I think also consciousness studies has massively expanded. You know, even,
Yes.
I mean, there's the very sort of hard-nosed neuroscience end, but even there, with things like psychedelic research,
Yes.
they've been forced to engage with extraordinary human experience, and I think
Yes.
it's sort of I've noticed this in at my at the University of Sussex, where I did my PhD, about as materialistic a centre as you can get. They now have a centre of, well, they have a conscious research there, but they also have a psychedelic centre. And although again, it's often their output is expressed in very materialistic ways, my sense is, looking at some of the seminars they have, that there are actually people who might be a little bit on the quiet interested in a lot of things like psi and anomalous experience, but it does seem to be more of a presence there. And so I think, talking to Ed Kelly, and he was sort of saying that he thinks parapsychology will eventually be absorbed, if you like, into the broader consciousness studies field. And I think in some ways it's, at the very least, I think things are bursting open a little bit. So there is more potential for more exchange. But again, at the same time, we've got a long way to go. I think it's just...
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly what they're doing. Ed Kelly, of course, is at DOPS at University of Virginia. And yeah, this is exactly what they're trying to do here. That is to bring parapsychology into consciousness studies. It's the same thing that they were trying to do in Edinburgh, right? But in a different way. The University of Edinburgh has a parapsychology program too, and what they've been trying to do is bring people into mainstream psychology, and they've been very successful with that, right? Training people to regard parapsychology as within content, and some of that work has moved a little bit too far away, in my view, from parapsychology, but it's still the same sort of idea that you need to consider these issues within a mainstream psychology. I think it's really key. And coming back to some of the things we were saying earlier about the importance of this material, we didn't really pick up on this. Uh, but yeah, I mean, that these cases really are important for psychology, really important for understanding the human being, and eventually it'll catch up with that. You mentioned, the link maybe to trance phenomena because of the in sex change cases, right? That's what we call them. When a child remembers being a member of the opposite sex, what we see typically is in young childhood cross-sex behaviors, gender identity issues, right? Now, sometimes those go away as the children get older. If they last into maturity, though, they can lead to the gender identity conflicts, and that this leads right into trans stuff. And so yeah, I mean, this is a really, 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 really important topic, and you're right. I mean, it's really not appreciated yet, but this is the sort of thing, as these case phenomena become better known, will be will be appreciated, and it shows why it's important to get this research out of parapsychology and begin to show its links to the broader psychology and to biology.
Yes, 100%. And I think it's important for us to emphasize that when we talk about things like the gender non-conforming behavior, we're not saying that there isn't, say, a neurodevelopmental element, because I think there absolutely is. I think the research backs that up. But we're saying that we need to integrate our knowledge of biology in the brain with these other factors. I mean, I think Jim Tucker in his books has a really fascinating section, because he's a child psychologist, isn't he? So he talks
Psychiatrist, yeah.
about, yes, but he talks about our knowledge of when memories start forming in very young, in babies and young children. So one of the reasons why I find this phenomena of the young kids compelling, actually, is that there seems to be a window period. So it's not that the parents are like coaching them. And in fact, quite a few of the cases we've talked about, like I think James Leininger is an example, that the kid spontaneously seems to come out with memories all on their own. And then there seems to be this period of forgetting around 5 or 6, although it does vary, as you're sort of saying, in practice, but statistically. And that, to me, is a hint of some kind of process.
Yeah, absolutely. There's several things there. Yeah, Stevenson thought that the memories almost universally faded by age 8. We now know that that's not the case. We now know that very often they'll continue. Sometimes they do, and maybe half the cases they do fade, right? But that still leaves quite a number where some memories, and maybe not the complete memories, but some memories are retained. And we're beginning to get follow-up studies now of memory retention. Marietta Pelafanova from Dobbs has published one on American cases, and she has a couple of others, where they're following up Stevenson's cases, right? People who are now in their 50s and 60s and so forth. I've studied a follow-up of one of his Lebanese Druze cases, right? The guy is 60. And he's now living in Richmond, Virginia, close to where I am here in the States. And so it was easy to, interview him. But he was 5 and 6 when Stevenson studied his case. So, and he still has his memories at age 60. Right. And so I was able to look at the impact of him on of the memories across the lifespan. Um, and so this is part of it. I mean, so the memories they do affect young children. And if the memories are retained past childhood, they continue to affect people throughout their lives. And then another point is that the past life experiences can impact you even if you don't have memories. This is also clear from the research.
That's in the latter part of your book, and I found that fascinating because I sometimes said, "Oh, I used to say, oh, I have no memory of living before," but then I thought, well, actually, this is perhaps vanity, but someone sort of called me an old soul. I did begin to wonder whether you couldn't have a subliminal sense
Right.
of having lived before.
Yeah.
But you're saying it's quite often very fragmentary, isn't it, and partial with adult.
Well, when memories come first in adulthood, it's different, right, than with kids. And I think you mentioned developmental issues, and I think that's for developmental reasons. Young children are, more malleable, more open, to this stuff. It's not the brain and the body are not yet fully mature, and so the memories have an easier time coming through, the behaviors have an easier time coming through, etc. When the memories come first in adulthood, they can't penetrate quite as well. One thing that we don't often think about, but we need to keep in mind, the transfer of these things to a new body, okay, involves neurological impacts, right? So it's not. We need to think of reincarnation, I think, in a psychogenic sense of reincarnating the mind coming in and influencing its new body. And part of the way it influences new body is we haven't really talked about birthmarks and birth defects, but that we can say something about that because that's a really important part of this. But the same process that produces the birthmarks and birth defects, I mean, in a general sort of way, not in a precise sort of way, which I believe is psychokinesis on the part of the incoming mind. That's where the psychogenic part comes in, can affect the brain too. And it's in affecting the brain that we get, by laying down neural pathways to support behaviors, that we get the habitual behaviors carrying over. We now know that all sorts of things like personality, emotions, and that's right, and things like this, everything about us practically is controlled by the brain and has neurological signatures. So in order for this sort of thing to be carried over, it would have to be transferred from the old body via the consciousness to the new body.
Yes. And I mean, again, I'm appreciating that we may be straining some listeners' boggle threshold slightly, but I think, yes, the birthmarks is actually pretty important. So Ian Stevenson actually wrote a vast 2-volume, was it 2 volumes, I think?
Yes, 2 volumes, over
on this, didn't he?
25, I think, almost 2,500 pages, over 2,000 pages. Yeah.
But yes, I remember in that, I'll link it actually, in the Search for the Dead episode, which is a very good introduction to the reincarnation cases. There's one case of, I think it was an Indian man who'd, his previous life has apparently lost his fingers in was it a thresher? And he actually had a deformity that seemed to link up with that. And there have been a number of cases like that, haven't there?
Like that. Yes, there have been. Yeah. Yeah, it was a boy. The previous person was a boy who accidentally put his hand, or maybe not accidentally, not realizing what he was doing, put his hand in a thresher, and the fingers were cut off. And when when a child was subsequently born with memories of his life with deformed fingers like that, yeah, and matching it. Yes, there are a lot of cases like that. Yeah, it is sort of boggle thresholdy, isn't it? When Stevenson first went to India, he basically dismissed this stuff. I mean, it was enough for him to be aware that, hey, it's not just memories. There's also behaviors, there's emotions, there's personality, and all this. It was a couple of years later that he finally was brought to realize, hey, I've got to pay attention to the physical stuff too, the birthmarks and birth defects. I had the same experience when I started reading this stuff. When I first read 20 cases, I passed over all of the birthmarks and all of this. That was too much for my boggle threshold. I was willing to think, well, maybe there is some reincarnation going on here, but I could not understand how it could possibly involve anything physical. And so I set that, and it was years, really, before I was able to say to myself, look, I'm reading so many cases with these physical things. I've got to explain them somehow. And it was in the course of writing my book and developing my course that you mentioned that I came to an understanding of it, of the mechanism of it that made sense to me, and that is a psychogenic mechanism. So it's not Stevenson's idea was that they were conveyed through what he called a psychophore, which is a subtle body, basically an astral body type thing. He thought that's how it was transferred. I think it's simpler than that. I think it's transferred by the consciousness using its PK to to affect the new body, right? And there's been theoretical work done now and the paper will be out very soon in the Journal of Scientific Exploration on saying exactly this, that consciousness can produce melanocytic birthmarks. Those are the darker sort of birthmarks by concentrating the melanin, right? And then we have other kinds of birthmarks which are that are produced by concentrating blood vessels, right? So these are the sorts of things that it would be possible for a PK, a bio PK, to bring about, right? Concentrating blood vessels or concentrating melanin to produce these effects, right? I mean, it's not that far-fetched, really. And if it happens there, it makes more plausible that then the same sort of thing could happen to transfer whatever needs to be transferred to bring about the sorts of carryovers that we see.
Well, that's it links it in with, I don't actually know whether you'd even necessarily need PK. Well, maybe you would, but I'm thinking of, we know that human beings can, during hypnosis or in cases of stigmata where people produce spontaneous wounds of Christ on their bodies, those are pretty well documented. But there are other kind of psychogenic cases too, like blister cases, that a strong belief and emotion seems to be able to produce sort of specific marks and wounds on the body
But
just in this life.
that's correct. That's very correct, and it's the same. It would be the same process. But how do we know that those aren't mediated by PK?
Well, yes. I mean, they're not very well understood at all, are they? Things like stigmata. So I think that's important to emphasize as well.
Yeah.
Actually, that
Yeah.
this is not, when it's important not just to consider the reincarnation and birthmark cases in isolation. There's that book in Irreducible Mind. Emily Williams Kelly writes a chapter on psychophysiological influence. So she looks at a spectrum of phenomena from simple placebo effects
I was
at the
going to
lower
mention.
end to sort of maternal impressions, which I think Stevenson looked at, and to these sort of birthmark cases for previous lives. So you could say there is actually a spectrum where the mind or the consciousness of a person affects the physical body.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I was going to bring in placebo effect because I think it's a very good example of this, right? Placebo effect is where, in an experiment, some subjects are given the real thing and others are given an inert substance, but told it's the real thing, and it turns out that it doesn't matter. I mean, if you're given an inert substance, if you believe that it's going to have an effect, it does. I mean, so think about that for a moment. So yes, our minds have great power to affect our bodies. And if that's true when we're embodied, why can't it be at the beginning of that embodiment,
And I mean, coming back to this is another feature we haven't really emphasized, but it's sort of been implicit that most of the kids that have past life memories, or many of them, the death was traumatic. So there seems to be an element of sort of PTSD here, doesn't there, sometimes?
Yeah, very often. I would say 50% or maybe even 60% of the cases have some sort of violent death. So it's not it's the majority, but not the overwhelming majority. There are plenty of other kinds of deaths too, but including natural deaths in old age, some of those cases too. So it's not like they all are. The thinking with them is that it's probably that the violent deaths are more memorable.
Okay, so I mean, this leads into the broader, the implications of all of this work. So do you think, well, I mean, there are a number of questions I could ask, but do you think we all reincarnate? And do you think we reincarnate once, or is it over and over again, like sort of a lot of traditions suggest? How do you think it works?
Yeah, well, yeah, no, I think we probably all do, again and again and again. I don't think it's a one-time thing. When I asked myself, as I had to when I was developing the course in the book, when do I think reincarnation began? The answer that came to me, the most logical answer, is when life began. And recent work, since the book, I would have covered this in the book if it were out then, but at least it's recent, and or that I wasn't aware of what had been done up until that point in this. But there's this stuff now coming out from the University of Oxford, for heaven's sake. So this is not significant stuff. Review books looking at consciousness of unicellular organisms like bacteria and so forth, saying that they seem to be conscious in some way, saying that they seem to operate deliberately in some way, saying that they seem to have memory. Right. And that just puts the lie to the whole philosophical skeptical argument that memories are recorded in the brain, because we're talking about long before there were brains or nervous systems, right? So the memories have to be somewhere else. Now, people doing this are still materialists. They still want to see this as a chemical basis of memory or whatever, or of consciousness. But it's not. Eventually, I think they're going to have to acknowledge that it's not. Even that's not the explanation. That consciousness is interfacing with this, so it's somehow recorded in consciousness. But you see, but this takes it back. I mean, if consciousness goes all the way back to the beginnings of life, then why can't reincarnation?
I think it leads in a panpsychic direction at the very least, or probably an idealistic direction. We can debate about that, and I'm not sure of the ultimate suitable metaphysic, but I definitely think that consciousness goes all the way down. And I'm a great fan of the late Lynn Margulis's work. She was a quite maverick biologist, and she was talking about the consciousness of microorganisms in the 80s and 90s.
Hmm.
And obviously, no one was
Nobody was
really
paying
listening
attention then, right?
then.
Yeah.
But no, you're right. I think if we're serious about trying to understand this in an evolutionary context, then I think we have to say that it's not just a human or even animal maybe it's some kind of universal thing that
Right.
happens.
Yeah, let's explain the philosophical terms, idealism and panpsychism, because I think they're really core here. Idealism is philosophically is the opposite of materialism. The idea of materialism is that everything is physical, right? Starts with the physical. The idea of philosophical idealism is that everything starts with consciousness. Right, and that consciousness is the ground of it all. So that's the idea of idealism, that consciousness is the ground of all, and this sort of leads into it's very compatible with panpsychism, which you mentioned. Panpsychism is the idea that everything is conscious or everything has consciousness of some sort. Now, I don't think we want to say that that bacteria are conscious in the same way we are. I mean, that would be foolish. But to say that they have consciousness, I think that's fair. Now, one of the interesting things to me is when did we can think of consciousness as being duplex, of having a subconscious level and having a superconsciousness level. In Myers' terms, a subliminal and supraliminal consciousness, right? And very often, philosophers who talk about consciousness think only of the supraliminal, of conscious awareness being conscious, right? The hard problem of consciousness that has to do with the supraliminal, right? But I think it's important to keep in mind that consciousness is duplex in that way, that there's a subconscious and then there's the conscious awareness on top of that, right? And so the interesting question is, in relation to that, if we think of it that way, did conscious awareness, a supraliminal consciousness, did that develop later phylogenetically? Is the subconscious more basic? Is it the subconscious type of consciousness when we think about bacteria being conscious, right? And at what point then, maybe when animals or maybe is part of the animal evolution, once animals came into being, that we start getting, a supraliminal consciousness, maybe. Or is it
Yeah,
further along? I mean, we just don't know yet.
I think these processes that we're talking about, however anomalous, did it probably evolve? And I think it's important to sort of think about that. I think it's important for researchers to think about that a little bit more, because I think we've got more than enough to say there's something anomalous going on here. And but I also think it's very important to try and fit those anomalies as best we can into that wider body of knowledge too, because I think that's another criticism, isn't it? Oh well, these are all, we can just put them in a box and we can explain most of everyday consciousness or whatever in conventional terms, but these things, they're really irrelevant because they're just separate, and we need to be developing those links with sort of more mainstream knowledge really as well.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And it's not just developing the links and let's say, an empirical way. I think we need to develop this theoretically. I think we need to have a good, solid theory of reincarnation, right? That makes sense of these phenomena but doesn't require us setting aside anything that we know from psychology, from biology. I think of this as sort of an analogy with quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics didn't require setting aside anything in Newtonian mechanics. It just augmented it, right? It just increased it. It showed that Newtonian mechanics is restricted to a certain domain. But in order to understand all of reality, we need to expand it. We need to think larger than that. And so that's sort of how I think about this. I mean, there's nothing wrong with what we know about psychology and biology of anything. We just need to include reincarnation too. I mean, another way of putting this is that we're not just the products of our heredity and our environments. We're not just nature and nurture. We're nature, nurture plus reincarnation, right? Or we need to make nature include reincarnation.
If what we're saying is right, then it has massive implications for our lives, because I think
Yes.
in our kind of very sort of consumer industrial culture, if you like, we're often very geared to this life, to material gain, to status, and all of those very external things. But I mean, for you, has it changed the way you live your life, or do you think it makes a difference, or is it just something that we have to, think about after we finish with it everyday stuff?
Right. I can't say that it has really changed how I live my life, but I can see how for some people it definitely would. Like you mentioned, your transference, that insight did help. For me, it's more abstract, sort of intellectual understanding.
Because it's funny though, I noticed, we talk to people with past, sort of adults with past life memories who had nowhere to go until, so for example, you have a Facebook page, don't you? And quite often people who've had these experiences come onto that Facebook page. And do you think that that's a valuable service that needs to be offered, sort of a place where people can go, particularly if they have direct experience of these sorts of reincarnation memories?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yes, I have a Facebook group, and if your listeners are on Facebook, join us. It's called Signs of Reincarnation, and just like my book, but the subtitle is different: Experiences and Research. And yes, we invite people to have their experiences, and then we do something unusual for Facebook, and that is the admins come in from the research point of view, and all the admins have gone through my course, like you have. So they're all equipped, they're ready, to give a research point of view on it. So we allow people to talk about their experiences, but we try to relate it back to the research. Well, I started this group 10 years ago now, thinking that I was going to communicate the research, let people know about the research. I was not initially prepared for how many people would come in with their experiences, right?
Mm.
And I wasn't really prepared at the time with how many people would then react with saying, "I'm so glad to have a place that I can talk about this because I can't. My family won't. My friends don't listen to me, and you know." But to talk with other people about these things and then to learn from the research about this stuff and realize I'm not so crazy after all, I'm not bonkers, that and there are other people like me who have gone through this, or conversely, my children, my grandchildren, seeing them in a new light, right? And it's not just my group. The social media, there are other groups on Facebook now that deal with this stuff, and you find it in Reddit, Quora, over social media. And I think that social media has really done a lot at allowing people to share experiences. And what has happened is that as they have shared experiences, the social media allow other people to come in and say, "Hey, this resonates with me," and it just snowballs. So I think gradually we become more comfortable with it, and young people may be consumers of this stuff more than old people, but young people grow up. They go on to get their doctorates. They go on to do research at universities, right? So I think this is going to change over time. I think it's going to have a very big effect.
I do. I mean, I get the sense there is actually a cultural shift. So apparently, there's been a resurgence in interest in spirituality and religion with sort of Gen Z and things like that. And to be honest, Jim, it doesn't surprise me very much because I think we do live in there is a great crisis of meaning at the moment, and I think these sorts of experiences, if you essentially think that you're larger than just your material body and brain, I think that does make a difference, even if it's sort of on a subtle level.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. It's just that yeah, I'm sure it does. It's just I tend to be more cerebral, I guess, and not go into all of that. But yeah, I can understand how it would be and it had a profound impact on some people. But
Mm.
also, I've been living with this for a very long time, right? And so I've sort of it's not like it's just hitting me all of a sudden and has that effect. I've had plenty of years. Another question you haven't asked me, but I'm often asked: Do you believe in reincarnation? Right? So let me comment on that, because my response now is I think reincarnation is the only intellectually responsible conclusion one can reach from the case data, right? So I don't, and no, I don't have my own past life memories. I've just talked to a lot of people. I've studied a lot of cases. I've read a lot of the cases, and the other kind of research on this. And that's the conclusion I've come to. There just is not any other satisfactory way of explaining this. It's the only, to my mind, intellectually responsible conclusion one could reach. But it took me years to get there, right? I thought through a lot of different stuff. I didn't reach that until I was developing the lectures for the course that became the book.
That's right, and I think we ought to emphasise that it's not just an argument between sort of skeptics and reincarnation people, but there's also an argument in psychical research and parapsychology saying that it might be what's called super psi. So the arguments are essentially that it's not really reincarnation, but the information is coming from the sort of psi abilities of the living. And that's a whole nother kettle of fish as well. But I think we need to emphasize that conclusion has been very hard fought, hasn't it?
Yes, I think it has been, and this is something you're bringing up something I think is interesting to a lot of people, and they don't realize. In parapsychology, there's a lot of skepticism about survival in general. A lot of parapsychologists are the skeptical sort, and they're more into their experiments, and they're not really that interested in survival now. I think this is changing. Even places like Northampton are becoming more interested in survival things. But it goes back. It goes back decades to when J.B. Rhine started his experiments, and it was card guessing experiments at the time on ESP, and throwing dice to investigate PK. And people who were drawn to that sort of research were not the same people who had been drawn to earlier generations of psychical researchers who were interested in survival, right? And so we had several decades then of people more interested in investigating things in the laboratory than investigating things in the field, people's experiences in the field, um, or being interested in survival. And so for them, survival is something that just doesn't seem real. I mean, they sort of more buy into the idea that that consciousness is generated by the brain or something, which is something I've never understood, right? Because if you're interested in psi, I don't see how you can explain that if consciousness is generated by the brain. And I think this is one of the big problems that parapsychologists who will not countenance survival run into, because they can't really fathom it. If, however, psi is a property of consciousness, right? And consciousness not only exists apart from the brain and body, but continues after the death of the body, then the problem goes away. Then psi is very much compatible with survival of consciousness, very much so. And once you've opened the door that way, there's no reason to say consciousness could not be affiliated with a new body, right? And that's how I think of reincarnation. I think of it as a possession of consciousness with a new body.
I think for me, the psi phenomena actually increase the probability of something like survival happening rather than decrease it.
Yeah.
But I mean, it partly, we could get into splitting hairs here because there are lots of theories of psi that try to avoid looking at that. So, I mean, there's, quantum mechanical theories and probability theories and synchronicity ideas. But for me, I think Stephen Browdy was right, actually. He says once you open the door to these things,
Mm-hmm.
such as our state of ignorance, it's difficult not to start thinking about everything else. So, and I think maybe this is one reason why, I think this is maybe a reason why skeptics are so all or nothing about it, because I've noticed this. It's like either you accept, the idea seems to be either you accept all of it or nothing. And I think that might sound, oh, well, that means you just become gullible. And that's not true, because I think it's important to have critical thinking. It's absolutely crucial. But at the same time, it's partly talking to people. The more, I've had some quite anomalous experiences myself, but more than that, talking to people. I was talking to someone the other week who'd had a near-death experience and a spontaneous remission of cancer, and I thought, I can't explain that. But I talk to people like that all the time, particularly, on the course that I help teach. People come on and they say that I've had this experience, and I think, well, who am I to say you haven't?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's you made some important points there. With Stephen Brody is an interesting character here. When we talk about the need for critical thinking in this, critical thinking is a buzzword that skeptics use, right? For them, critical thinking means you think in a materialist sort of way. But the thing is, that is not critical thinking. Critical thinking is you take into account other possibilities and you try to find your way through this. What fits the best? What makes the most sense? So critical thinking that does not take into account even the possibility of anything other than materialism, for me, is not true critical thinking. I mean, that's just bias. That's just prejudice. But Brody is an interesting person in this because he is one of the philosophers who is biggest on super psi. In fact, he invented the term super psi. It went back some time ago to super ESP, which another psychical researcher, parapsychologist called Cornell Hart thought up. Um, but Brody modernized this, took super ESP and added PK to make it super psi, right?
Yep.
And so Brody he says that, and he is right, right? You need critical thinking, but his critical thinking stops there. He is one of the people, he's one of the parapsychologists who can't countenance survival, right? And so he wants to explain all survival phenomena as being super psi, including physical mediumship, which he wants to explain by PK, right? Poltergeist, the living agent poltergeist sort of thing. But the super psi thing, and I need to say something about that, there are real problems with it. I mean, the whole super psi thing, the premise of it starts with we don't know the limits of psi, right? Psi is the term that parapsychologists use for ESP plus PK. And it's quite true. We don't really know the limits of that, right? We don't really know, the limits of it. On the other hand, we know from both laboratory experiments and people's spontaneous memories, their experiences, that ESP is mainly about information that you can get from another mind or clairvoyantly from a piece of paper or something, right? Or remote viewing, going out and seeing another place. It's that kind of information. It does not include the sort of information you see in these cases, the behavioral stuff, the emotional stuff, all of these things. So the cases that they're trying to explain by super psi, they cannot explain all of the richness of the case phenomena by super psi. They just can't. So if these cases were just memories, right? Okay, it would be hard then to dismiss the super psi possibility because maybe that's true. Maybe if all it is these memories, maybe the kids have some sort of super psychic ability, to go out and get the information. The other problem with the super psi is where other point that it breaks down is with birthmarks and birth defects and the physical stuff, because what you need there, the only way that I can think of that that you can explain this by super psi is saying that it's the mother's super psi when she was pregnant. When she's pregnant by her psi unconsciously, because she's not aware of this, you have to keep that in mind, it's totally unconsciously, she's going out by her super psi, learning about somebody else that she doesn't know, she has no connection to, and somehow is learning about how this person died, or with the birthmarks and birth defects, it's important to realize it's not just how people died. It can be it can be earrings, it can be tattoos, it can be anything of significance. So the mother has to become aware of the significance of this person to a deceased, of all this sort of information to a deceased person. She then has to unconsciously impress all of this stuff on the fetus in her womb. She furthermore has to telepathically communicate with her unborn child, download to the unborn child all the information that she has picked up psychically, unconsciously. And then the child, you have to imagine, then the child is going to grow up thinking falsely that they were this person. I don't see how else you can explain all of the case phenomena. I just don't see it. And so, but that means if you're going to, super psi involves maternal impression, and it requires the mothers using their super psi, not the kids. To me, they just become so far-fetched, it's impossible to believe. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, what you're saying is the alternative explanations end up being more cumbersome than simply saying it's rebirth or reincarnation.
That's right. That's exactly right. And then you see, for some people, it's the opposite, right? They think that any sort of survival phenomena has to be so far out that even though some sort of some sort of natural normal explanation may be far fetched too, it's preferable. And so you get that sort of thinking also. But it comes down to, for me, it comes down to the data. And why it's so important, forget the critics and skeptics, to actually look at the data, either the case data or the pattern data, to look at the data and wrestle with that and see whether they still satisfied with explaining it away.
Yeah, yes, totally. And I think that's sort of my orientation too, because I like to, I have, everybody, no matter how skeptical they claim to be, has beliefs about the world they can't prove, but it's always preferable, if you can, I think, to try and back it up with something, with evidence. Really, you're also right about critical thinking. I notice this all the time. I mean, for me, critical thinking, it's like, well, it's a skill, but it's more like doing a detective work. So it's not saying I don't believe this, I don't believe that. It's about being able to do that detective work and work through those possibilities, like you said. And for me, that's a much more satisfying definition of critical thinking than just I'm a skeptic, I don't believe any of this stuff. Yeah, we're sort of coming towards the end of the interview, Jim. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on at the moment, and maybe where you'd like this research to go in the future?
Well, where I would like the research to go in the future is I I make the distinction between proof-oriented and process-oriented research, and I need to explain that because many people don't understand quite what I mean by it. It's a philosophical sort of distinction. Stevenson's research was very proof-oriented. He was very much focused on the evidence for reincarnation that emerges through these cases. By process, I mean not just the process of reincarnation, but also the process of past life remembering. And what I mean is beginning to appreciate how these cases relate to psychology and biology. Because I think as we get more into the process sort of things, that we'll have an easier time relating the research to mainstream interests. Right. And so this is where I think Stevenson went wrong. I understand why he went wrong when because at the time, I mean, the most important thing was to make people take this stuff seriously, right? But ultimately, I think that that acceptance was held back because of such a focus on the proof, the evidential aspects of it, and that's what allowed the skeptics to focus on that aspect of it. Whereas if he had done more with the patterns, but more with showing, the connections to psychology, that it would have been that there would have been more of a bridge there, I guess, is what I'm saying. And so that's one thing that I hope will happen, and I try to do encourage. Now, I'm involved in several different things now, but one of them, most interesting one, and I'll leave you with this because we don't, as you say, we're running out of time, is becoming interested in the link between autism and past life memory. Autism is a neurological, if not always disorder, it involves neurological changes. I mean, we now know through DNA that autism, these things go all the way back to the Neanderthals. It seems like the Neanderthals were autistic. So this isn't something that's new. It's not something, it's something that's been with us all along. We're maybe paying more attention to it now. Maybe certain types of it are becoming more prevalent, but it's because of, certain genetic things may be becoming more plentiful, or more salient or whatever that it is. But we're talking about very old sorts of effects. And what I'm seeing is that these effects can affect past life memory. I've studied 3 cases now that are really very interesting cases where artistic individuals demonstrated through behavior, sometimes through physical things, that they were a specific previous person. At least they strongly suggested that. However, they had no declarative past life memories. Okay? At the same time, they had invisible playmates or invisible companions, I prefer to call them, on whom they seemed to have displaced their memories. In other words, they endowed their invisible companions with information that seems to have been drawn from their previous life experience. Now, that is interesting enough. When you look at the autistic literature, you find that for many autistic people, their episodic memories are suppressed. The episodic memory formation is suppressed, right? Other types of memory, which involve other regions of the brain, are not. And this is exactly what we see in these cases. The other kinds of memory come through. We have recognition memories, we have behavioral memories, we have physical things. We don't have the episodic memories. And because we don't have the episodic memories, we don't have the sense of the individual, I was this person before. Because that's something with these kids. They talk about it in first person. We don't have that with these autistic individuals, right? So that this is part of what's interested me. But as I've gotten more into this, it becomes even more interesting because some autistic people do have episodic past life memories, and they have them in spades. They have them in a much better developed way than we see with neurotypical people. Right? So it seems to affect them both ways, but the common denominator of theirs is the neurological effects that go with autism.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, I wonder whether that relates to some of the work with the telepathy tapes that's being done at the moment. There was a podcast that,
Yeah, I know. Diane Powell. Yeah, I am aware of that. Yeah, maybe. I mean, it could. I mean, keep in mind. I mean, with the telepathy tape is about psi, right? About particularly with in non-speaking autistics, exhibiting psi. Psi ability, even though it comes into reincarnation, is different from past life memory. If we're talking about psi, it would be super psi, right? So it's a difference between using super psi and memory. So memory is a different sort of process than psi, right? However, where they begin to relate to each other is that when we're talking about past life memories, we're talking about subconscious stuff, right? We're talking about stuff that's not necessarily conscious, right? And psi comes from the subconscious too, right? So
Yeah.
there is that relation there. And so anything that neurological that can facilitate the subconscious psi processes, in principle, might facilitate the memory. And so that would be, but one of the things I need to look at is how common it is for autistic people with past life memories also to have psi, because we see that with the neurotypicals too. Like Rylan, for instance, she had some precognitive experiences too, right? But it doesn't happen with all children. It doesn't happen with all adults and all people who have past life memories. They're not all psychic. So it's just like all psychic people don't necessarily have past life memories. So there seem to be separate things. They really see separate things. And I'm not sure at this point, I'm not convinced at this point that there's any necessary correlation between them. I think it's just that by chance that some people have both. But it's something we need to look at. It's something we need to look more closely at.
Well, that certainly sounds like a very fascinating new potential branch of research for this particular field. So yeah, I'll be very interested to see what you come up with.
Yeah, it is very interesting because, and I'll leave it at this because I want to get this in, because if it's neurological, if past life memory is neurological, what I mean by that is if there is something neurological that facilitates past life remembering, okay, that means in principle it's something that's inheritable. And if it's inheritable, this could help us explain why certain populations, like the Druze, have more of these memories than other populations. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it's provocative and interesting new line of research, I think. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for giving your time for this interview. It's been really fascinating, and I think listeners will be very, very intrigued. So, just to finish, are you still offering your online course? Because we can put links to that on your Facebook page in the show notes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yes, I am still a couple of times a year. It'll next be offered. It's just finished. This session is just finished. I'll next be offering it beginning in January, middle of January.
Okay, that's
So I can
brilliant.
come up if you want to put it in. I mean, I can pin down a date and give you a date if you'd like to put that in.
Yes, that will be great. But no, I think I'm hoping to encourage as much interest in this topic as possible, because I think it's of great interest, potential interest to anyone who's interested in the big questions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, well, yeah. If I have just one more minute here,
Oh, that's fine.
yeah. No, I just want to say about the course, not to mislead people. It is a graduate level seminar course, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's taught at a graduate level, and it's 15 weeks long. It's a semester long course. So I don't want to mislead people that it's something casual. They're really going to get into this material.
I absolutely, and I can sort of say, as someone who's done it, that if you really want to take a deep dive, it is challenging in some respects. There is quite a lot of reading, but you read and you think and discuss. And if you want to take a deep dive, then I'd highly recommend it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, and thank you for this. I've enjoyed being here and talking to you.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
What Lies Beyond with your host Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for purchase on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.